Fluorescence flickered, casting a sickly yellow hue over the trauma bay. Nora scrubbed dried vomit off her forearm, staring blankly at a screaming heart monitor. She hadn't fired a rifle in 4 years, yet navigating this Tuesday night triage felt exactly like holding a collapsing perimeter in Kandahar. Fluorescence hummed, emitting a jagged, relentless frequency that burrowed straight behind Nora's eyes. She stood over bed 4, her purple nitrile-gloved hands pressing a thick gauze pad against a weeping leg ulcer. The smell was dense and heavy, a cloying fermented sweetness mixed with the sharp bite of iodine and stale urine. She didn't gag. She hadn't gagged in years. Her jaw remained loose, her breathing shallow and perfectly regulated through her mouth, a reflex drilled into her long before she ever donned teal scrubs. "He's tachycardic," Chloe whispered. The younger nurse stood at the foot of the bed, a tablet trembling slightly in her hands. Chloe smelled like vanilla body spray and panic. It was a terrible combination, one that made Nora's nose itch. "He's withdrawing, Chloe. His pulse is going to bounce," Nora said, her voice a flat, gravelly monotone that betrayed neither sympathy nor alarm. She peeled back the soiled gauze. The skin underneath was mottled angry red, turning to necrotic black at the edges. "Hand me the saline and stop tapping your foot. It echoes off the linoleum." Chloe stopped immediately, swallowing hard. She handed over the plastic bottle. Nora squeezed the saline, watching the clear liquid wash over the ruined tissue, diluting the thick yellow exudate. It looked like a battlefield wound left too long in the humid jungle heat. She had seen worse, much worse. The thought didn't make her feel heroic. It just made her profoundly tired. A dull ache radiated from her lower back, a constant companion since a bad drop over a dusty ridge in Helmand 6 years ago. Dr. Peter Gable swept past the curtain, a whirlwind of heavily starched white cotton and expensive cologne that aggressively overpowered the scent of decay in the room. He didn't look at the patient's face. He looked at the monitor, then at his tablet, swiping with a manicured finger. "Antibiotics, dress it. Admit him to the floor. Bed 12 is freeing up." Gable barked, already turning to leave. Nora paused, the saline bottle still poised. She glanced at the monitor. Tachycardia. Sweating. But there was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the man's jaw, and his pupils were blown wide. "He needs Ativan, doctor, before he goes up. He's bordering on delirium tremens." Gable stopped, his shoulder dropping into a defensive slouch. He turned his head just enough to glare at her from his periphery. "He's an alcoholic with a bad leg, Nora. Just clean it. I don't need a nursing assessment on neurology right now. I have 3 traumas waiting. He's going to seize in the elevator," Nora stated, not raising her voice. She didn't care about Gable's ego. She cared about the paperwork she'd have to fill out if a patient coded in transit. She cared about the extra hour it would keep her from going home to a quiet, dark apartment and a stiff drink. Just prep him for transport. Gable snapped, disappearing down the hall. Nora sighed a sound that tasted like stale coffee and defeat. She dropped the empty saline bottle into the red biohazard bin with a hollow thud. She looked at Chloe, who was staring wide-eyed at the curtain where the doctor had vanished. "Draw up 2 milliliters of Ativan," Nora instructed, stripping off her gloves. They made a wet snapping sound, but Dr. Gable didn't order. "I have a standing protocol for CIWA." Nora interrupted, walking toward the sink. "I'll sign off on it. Just draw it up. Unless you want to wrestle a 200 lb man when his brain starts firing like a strobe light." She hit the metal lever of the sink with her elbow. Hot water blasted out, scalding her hands. She pumped the pink industrial soap, scrubbing vigorously. The cheap antiseptic stung fiercely where a jagged paper cut split her left index finger. The pain was sharp, grounding. It pulled her out of the sterile haze of the hospital and anchored her in her own body. As she scrubbed, the suds turned a faint, muddy brown from the grime of the shift. 12 hours. 12 hours of bodily fluids, screaming relatives, arrogant residents, and the constant rhythmic beeping of alarms that sounded exactly like the proximity sensors on a heavily armored transport vehicle. Nora grabbed a rough paper towel, ripping it from the dispenser with unnecessary force. It felt like sandpaper against her raw knuckles. She leaned her forehead against the cool, condensation-slicked glass of the small mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back, entirely unimpressive. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her hair, an indistinct shade of brown, was scraped back into a messy, utilitarian knot. A faint silvery scar ran from the edge of her jaw down toward her collarbone. A souvenir from a piece of shattered shrapnel, barely visible unless she turned her head just right. "Nobody," she whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the reflection. "You're just a nobody who cleans up messes." It was a mantra, a survival tactic, a way to push down the dormant spring inside her chest that sometimes threatened to snap when a patient lashed out or a doctor gave a stupid, fatal order. She took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp tang of bleach from the freshly mopped hallway outside. Time to push another bed. Time to chart another meaningless shift. They didn't move like doctors. Doctors walked with a frantic, disorganized hustle, shoulders thrown forward, eyes fixed on an invisible finish line. Cops swaggered, heavy on their heels, thumbs hooked in their duty belts. These men walked from the hips. Nora spotted them from the nurse's station, her fingers hovering over a greasy, sticky keyboard. 3 of them. They tracked rain across the meticulously buffed linoleum of the ER lobby, leaving a trail of watery footprints. The heavy wet wool of their overcoats smelled distinct like cold asphalt and damp iron. It cut straight through the hospital's ambient scent of hand sanitizer and sickness. The immediate drop in ambient noise was palpable. The usual chaotic chatter of the waiting room died down. Even the coughing stopped for a few seconds. The trio bypassed the security guard who barely had time to put down his lukewarm coffee before they blew past his podium. Nora's eyes flicked to their waists. Suit jackets hung a little too straight, deliberately tailored to conceal the bulky contour of a sidearm. They weren't local detectives. Detectives wore cheap suits and looked exhausted. These men wore tailored navy and charcoal, and their eyes scanned the room in precise, measured quadrants. "Can I help you?" Brenda, the charge nurse, asked. She stood up from her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. Brenda was 50, ruthless, and entirely unimpressed by men in suits. The lead agent stopped at the high counter. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a leather wallet. He didn't flip it open like they did on television. He simply laid it on the counter, leaving his hand resting over it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. "We're looking for an employee." Brenda leaned forward, squinting at the badge. "This is a hospital agent. Kinsley, not a precinct. Who are you looking for?" "Captain Hayes," Kinsley said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that didn't bounce off the walls. It carried directly to its target. Brenda frowned, her brow furrowing deeply. "We don't have military personnel here. You've got the wrong facility. The VA is 3 miles down the interstate. She isn't listed under that name on your payroll," Kinsley replied, leaning his forearms on the counter. His eyes drifted away from Brenda, scanning the bustling corridor behind the desk. They swept past a vomiting teenager, skipped over an orderly pushing a laundry cart, and locked directly onto Nora. Nora didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She felt the muscles in her neck tighten, pulling the skin taut over her jawline. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion washed over her, heavier than the 12 hours of standing on concrete floors. Damn it. She hit the enter key on her keyboard, saving her charting notes on bed 4. The plastic key gave a hollow click. She didn't look at Kinsley. Instead, she picked up her cold, half-empty styrofoam cup of coffee, peeled off the plastic lid, and dumped it into the trash can. It splashed against the plastic liner with a wet smack. Nora. Dr. Gable had appeared from Trauma Room 1, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at the agents, then at Brenda, and finally at Nora. "What's going on? Who are these guys?" Kinsley ignored the doctor completely. He stepped around the counter uninvited, his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. He stopped 3 FT from Nora, giving her enough space so she wouldn't feel cornered, a calculated, tactical distance. "Captain," Kinsley said softly. Nora kept her eyes on the computer screen, though she had already logged out. "There's no one here by that title. You're blocking the crash card. We need you to come with us." Kinsley's tone was polite, but completely devoid of an exit strategy. It was a statement of fact. "Nora, do you know these men?" Gable stepped forward, puffing his chest out slightly. "Hey pal, you can't just walk back here. This is a restricted area. She's in the middle of a shift. We're down 2 float nurses as it is. Doctor, please back," one of the other agents said, moving instinctively to cut off Gable's path. The movement was so fluid, so effortlessly dominant, that Gable actually took a half-step backward, suddenly looking very small in his white coat. Nora finally turned around. She leaned her hip against the counter, crossing her arms. She looked down at her clogs. There was a smear of someone else's blood on the toe of her right shoe. She looked up at Kinsley. "I have 3 hours left on my shift, Kinsley. I have a patient in bed 6 waiting for a catheter, and the man in bed 4 just threw up on his own shoes. I don't have time for a reunion." Kinsley's expression didn't change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Victor Olaf is in Seattle." The name didn't cause a dramatic gasp, but the silence that fell over Nora felt louder than a siren. Her pulse, previously a steady resting 60 beats per minute, spiked instantly. She tasted copper in the back of her mouth. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum at a higher, more violent pitch. "Olaf is dead," Nora said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Hoarse. "He burned in a warehouse in Damascus." "He didn't," Kinsley replied. "He took a federal courthouse hostage 40 minutes ago. He's wired the structural supports with C4. He let one hostage go with a message. He won't negotiate with the HRT. He's asking for the architect of the Damascus raid." Nora stared at him. The smell of the ER, the bleach, the sickness, the sweat faded, replaced by the phantom stench of burning diesel and charred brick. She looked at Dr. Gable, who was staring at her as if she had suddenly mutated into an alien species. She looked at Brenda, whose mouth was slightly open. There was no hiding anymore. The scrub uniform suddenly felt incredibly thin, offering no armor at all against the ghosts that had finally tracked her down. Nora unclipped her hospital ID badge from her collar. She didn't hand it to Brenda. She just dropped it on the keyboard. It landed with a sharp clatter. "Get my coat," Nora said, not looking at anyone in particular. "And tell Olive I'm going to finish the job." Rain hammered the armored glass of the Suburban, distorting the neon city lights into bleeding, smeared streaks of red and blue. Nora sat in the cavernous back seat, staring blankly at the rivulets of water. She hadn't bothered to change out of her teal scrubs. The thin, cheap cotton offered absolutely zero insulation against the aggressive air conditioning blasting from the rear vents. She shivered once. It wasn't the ambient temperature. It was the low-frequency vibration of the vehicle's heavy engine, a mechanical, guttural growl that woke up dormant nerve endings she had spent 4 agonizing years trying to sedate with 12-hour shifts and bad hospital coffee. Kinsley sat directly across from her, a waterproof tablet illuminating his face in a harsh, pale glow. He smelled strongly of spearmint gum, wet wool, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of gun oil. It was a scent profile that instantly transported Nora back to a dusty tarmac in Bagram. She hated it. She hated how familiar it felt, and she hated the ugly, shameful spike of adrenaline that accompanied it. "Here," Kinsley said, his voice flat. He flipped a laminated blueprint onto the seat beside her. Federal courthouse, built in the 70s. Lots of poured concrete, blind corners, and a central atrium that turns the whole building into a fatal funnel. Nora didn't touch the schematic immediately. She looked at her hands. The deep, stinging paper cut on her left index finger from the hospital sink throbbed in time with her pulse. Her fingernails were still stained faintly pink from the antiseptic soap. She traced the outline of the building's first floor with her eyes, letting her brain automatically calculate lines of sight, choke points, and structural weak spots. All of she rasped, her throat still tight. She cleared it, coughing dryly into her fist. He burned in Damascus. I watched the roof collapse. I felt the heat on my face from 3 blocks away. He crawled out through a subterranean drainage pipe. Kinsley replied, swiping a finger across his tablet. He brought up a surveillance photo. 30% of his body is covered in 3rd-degree burns. He's missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He's functioning entirely on grievance and whatever painkillers he can source on the black market. He took the building exactly 47 minutes ago. 2 security guards are dead. He has 12 hostages corralled in the main courtroom on the 3rd floor, and he's wired the load-bearing pillars in the basement with enough C4 to drop the entire structure into the parking garage. Nora finally picked up the blueprint. The laminated plastic felt cold and slick. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel a sudden righteous calling to save the day. She felt a profound, exhausting headache blooming right behind her eyes. "He specifically asked for you," Kinsley added, watching her reactions closely. "He told the negotiator that if anyone from the hostage rescue team steps foot inside the lobby, he blows the pillars. He wants Captain Hayes. He wants the woman who ordered the strike." "I was doing a catheter change," Nora murmured almost to herself. A bitter, cynical laugh scraped its way up her throat. "I was arguing with a resident about Ativan. You aren't a nurse, Nora. You're just wearing their clothes." She snapped her eyes up to meet his. The look she gave him held no theatrical anger, just a heavy, deadened weight. "I saved more lives in that ER this week than I ever did wearing a plate carrier for you, Kinsley." The Suburban jerked to a halt. The heavy doors unlocked with a loud mechanical clunk. Stepping out into the Seattle downpour was like stepping into a cold shower. The rain instantly soaked through her scrubs, pasting the fabric to her skin. A perimeter of flashing police cruisers, black armored trucks, and yellow tape surrounded the plaza of the courthouse. The chaotic strobes of red and blue lights glinted off puddles and wet asphalt. Dozens of tactical officers stood behind heavily armored shields, the rain drumming a relentless, chaotic rhythm against their helmets. Kinsley led her toward a mobile command center, a massive black RV humming loudly with a diesel generator. The interior was cramped, smelling of wet nylon, stale sweat, and electrified dust. Radios squawked in a constant, overlapping stream of static and tense voices. A heavy-set man in full tactical gear, Commander Gibson, according to the Velcro patch on his chest, turned from a bank of monitors. He looked Nora up and down, his upper lip curling into a barely concealed sneer. "This is her, the ghost? She looks like she just got off a double shift at a clinic." "She's who Olive wants," Kinsley stated, bypassing Gibson entirely and moving toward a metal footlocker. He popped the heavy steel latches. "Gear up, Captain." Nora stood in the center of the command post. The air felt thick, difficult to breathe. She slowly reached up and unbuttoned the top of her scrub top. She didn't care about the eyes on her. She stripped off the damp teal fabric, tossing it carelessly onto a folding chair. Underneath, she wore a simple gray tank top. The jagged silvery shrapnel scar running down her collarbone caught the harsh overhead light. Kinsley handed her a black tactical shirt. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of factory chemicals. She pulled it over her head, the coarse material scraping against her skin. Next came the plate carrier. She hoisted it up, the heavy ceramic plates pressing down solidly onto her shoulders, instantly compressing her lungs. It was a familiar, suffocating weight. She fastened the side straps, pulling them tight until they bruised her ribs. Gibson pushed past Kinsley, thrusting a customized M4 carbine and a drop-leg holster toward her. "You have no comms once you cross the threshold. He's using a local jammer. We have thermal imaging on the 3rd floor, but the concrete is thick. If he hits that detonator, you have approximately 4 seconds before the floor drops out from under you. Do you understand, Hayes?" Nora ignored him. She took the M4. The cold machined aluminum of the receiver felt heavy and real in her hands. She pressed the magazine release. The heavy magazine dropped into her palm. She checked the top brass casing, ensuring it was seated correctly, then slammed it back into the magwell with a sharp, violent thwack. She racked the charging handle, chambering around. The mechanical intimacy of the weapon made her stomach churn. Just hours ago, she had been calibrating an IV drip to save a dying man. Now she was calibrating a trigger pull to kill a broken one. "I don't need comms," Nora said quietly, holstering a secondary sidearm against her thigh. The tactical belt sat heavy on her hips, aggravating the old injury in her lower back. "If the building explodes, you'll know I failed." She walked towards the reinforced doors of the command center, the heavy boots they had provided squeaking faintly on the wet floor. She didn't look back at Kinsley. She stepped out into the rain, the heavy steel door shutting behind her, sealing her off from the noise of the command post and locking her into the quiet, terrifying isolation of the approach. Marble floors shouldn't feel sticky, but they did. Nora pressed her shoulder against the fluted concrete column in the courthouse lobby, bypassing her nose to avoid the choking scent of cordite. Someone had shot out the security glass, leaving tiny crystalline cubes scattered across the floor. They crunched softly under her boots, an unavoidable sound that set her teeth on edge. With every agonizingly slow step, the stiff leather of her tactical boots rubbed a raw blister onto her left heel. She ignored it. Pain was just physical data she could manually override. Her focus was the heavy dead silence pressing down from floors above. Emergency lighting cast greenish shadows across the walls. Dust motes danced too lazily in the dim beams. She climbed the steps, leading with her M4. Her muscles burned, protesting the shift from 12 hours of hospital walking to the high-tension crouch of urban combat. Third floor. The heavy oak doors to courtroom A hung slightly open. From inside, Nora heard the exhausted, broken whimpering of someone terrified for too long. Nora lowered her weapon slightly, resting the stock against her hip. She didn't want to come through the door aggressively. If she acted like a SWAT operator, Orlov would press the button. She pushed the oak door. The hinges let out a dry groan. "Stop." The voice came from the judge's bench, raspy and damaged. Nora stepped into the room. 12 hostages sat huddled on the floor, hands zip-tied. The smell of fear was overwhelming: sour sweat, urine, and cheap cologne. Viktor Orlov sat in the leather chair behind the elevated judicial bench. The left side of his face was a ruin of melted tissue, pulling his eye into a permanent squint. From his right hand, a thick wire trailed into his pocket. A dead man's switch. If his grip relaxed, the circuit would complete, vaporizing the basement pillars. "Victor," Nora said, her voice tired and conversational. She let the M4 hang entirely loose on its sling, keeping her hands empty. Orlov's remaining eye locked onto her. He looked utterly exhausted, a ghost fueled by spite. "Hayes, you look different without the desert dirt on your face. You look awful, Victor," she replied, taking one slow step down the center aisle. His knuckles were white, trembling from the strain of holding the heavy trigger mechanism closed for an hour. "Do not patronize me." He spat. The leather chair squeaked as he shifted his weight. "You burned my family in that compound. Now you get to watch me burn yours." Nora stopped. The hospital pulled at her again. She looked at Olaf, not as an enemy combatant, but as a patient, sweating, tachycardic, bordering on delirium from exhaustion. His hand was shaking too much. He would drop the switch out of sheer muscle fatigue. "I didn't know your family was in the compound, Victor," Nora said, slipping into the exact grounded, monotone voice she used to calm violent psychiatric patients. "If I had known, I would have aborted the strike." "Liar," Olaf screamed. His grip tightened. "I'm not lying," Nora said softly. "Look at what I'm wearing under this vest. I'm a nurse, Victor. I spend my nights cleaning up messes. I left the unit because of what happened to you." It was a half-truth, a psychological wedge. Olaf blinked, his good eye darting down to the gray tank top visible beneath her gear. The mundane reality disrupted his script. He expected a stoic killer. He got a tired woman. "You suffer," Olaf whispered. "I do," Nora agreed. "But killing these people won't bring them back. It'll just make you exactly the monster I thought you were." For a fraction of a second, Olaf hesitated. The crushing weight of his grief momentarily overpowered his rage. His grip loosened just a millimeter. It was a neurological fault, but it was enough. Nora didn't think. The conditioned reflexes took over. She drew the Sig Sauer from her thigh holster in a blur of black steel, squeezing the trigger before the gun was fully leveled. Crack, crack. 2 deafening shots echoed. The first round struck Olaf in the shoulder, spinning him. The second caught his jaw. He collapsed backward over the leather chair. Nora sprinted up the wooden steps, throwing herself over the desk, landing heavily on Olaf's bleeding chest. He was choking, but his hand was open. The switch had fallen. She slammed her hand onto the plastic device, squeezing the trigger shot before the circuit engaged. Her fingers cramped instantly. She lay there, knees soaked in Olaf's blood. The hostages screamed as the tactical team breached the doors, heavy boots thundering inside. Nora didn't look up. She felt no triumph, just the cold realization that no matter how many bedpans she emptied, she would always be exceptionally good at exactly one thing. That was intense. Captain Hayes might have saved the hostages, but you can feel the heavy toll it took on her soul. Will she ever be able to go back to the hospital after this? Or has the FBI permanently pulled her back into the shadows? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you want to see where Nora's story goes next, smash that like button, share this video with your fellow thriller fans, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out.